Hello, my name is Scott, and welcome to Conversations with Darkness. Today, I sat down with my dear brother Eli, who recently joined us here at Sky Cave Retreats for a darkness retreat. We explore the path of rest and softening, intimacy and non-duality, dying to ourselves and our seeking for spiritual experiences, moving beyond preferences, and the profound journey in the dark. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Awesome. Eli, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah. So your dark retreat was a couple months ago now, and I'm really curious what awoke for you in there, how that has spilt over into your day-to-day, your life in form.
Mm-hmm. That's a long answer, but I'll try to be succinct. One of the most obvious ways that was a threshold and a shift was in a deep internal sense of intimacy. There was an intimacy with my own life force. And I wish I could convey that in words, but it can't be conveyed in words. It's only conveyed really through the heart and through the feeling within of being just fully enveloped, fully embraced by your own life force, by the animate force that gives you form every moment. That's the feeling, is that I've had this embrace that started in the darkness and that has just been changing the way that every day feels now. Every moment, every day, every conversation, even sitting here with you, it's so tangibly different. And it's probably best to reel it back and just share that before that darkness retreat, I was in a really difficult time. I was in a deep heartbreak. I had just lost one of my true beloved soul companions in this life and had gone through a major upheaval, and I was like super depressed. I was in a very dark place. And I've never experienced anything that was so thunderbolt transformative from that kind of despair to the level of intimacy and openness and trust. I've done a lot of deep spiritual inquiry. I've done, hundreds of days of silent meditation retreats. I've done a lot of deep self-study, darkness-related psychotherapy, like, shadow work. I've done a lot of plant medicine. I've done many, many things, and nothing really came close to what those 5 days in darkness with myself opened up. So it's good to give that context because it's highly relevant that there was a massive shift just by being alone in a dark room for 5 days. Seems so simple. It seems like, and I think that's why there's so much interest in this right now. From what I can tell, people are intrigued. What is this that happens within us when we are undisturbed with the intimacy of being? So what I experienced was a place that had been pushing a certain amount of my experience away just dissolved, just stopped resisting life. And there was such a consistent demand for that intimacy in the dark that you can only look away from that for so long, is my experience.
We do pretty good in our day-to-day. If you asked most people would probably say they're not in resistance to their life, except when it's unavoidable in their face, like something's really not going your way. But it looks different when you get into the dark and you actually realize how much resistance there really is.
That's so true. It's so easy to distract. It's amazing. I think that was one of the things that hit me hardest, was recognizing what significance visual input actually has in my human experience. Like, I do a lot of going out and, being engaged, being distracted and caught up in what's happening in the world because of being a visual being. It's so important. And in some ways, that actually is what I've taken out as well, is that this relational power of seeing and taking in light has a huge effect. The way that we actually interact with the world visually has a huge effect. That's something I'm really curious about, and I'm really wanting to know, people who are doing research on darkness retreats and understanding brain mapping, neurobiochemistry of the optical input and what changes in the human psychology with and without light and optical input. I'm fascinated by that because there's something big, very big going on in the absence of light and in the absence of input through the visual cortex. So super curious about that. But one of the things practically, I told you when we sat down this morning, like, I've been sort of ridiculously happy for no good reason. And I just keep waking up with this recognition that it's just because I have my whole life back. It's not just the parts I prefer. It's not just the parts my personality prefers. There's an intimacy of having my whole life. That doesn't translate very well. Like, when I hear those words, the feeling is that there's an indivisibility of being. Within myself, I'm not trying to push anything away. There's actually greater interest in being with than choosing between what arises, what I like and what I don't like. There's actually a greater love for being with whatever arises than pursuing whatever I might prefer. And that's kind of gets at that intimacy of being feeling, is that there's just a love for being.
What do you think creates that movement of wanting to be with whatever arises, as opposed to preferring something over what's arising? What is that within you that creates that movement?
Well, I can speak to the experience of that coming through a lot of struggle. That you can struggle and struggle and resist. And it just grinds you down to this like rock bottom place where, for me, I just realized that I'm not going to win. Like, I'm never actually going to get the world or myself to cooperate and deliver just what I prefer. Like, it's a losing game. It's just never going to turn out. My preferences are never going to be consistently delivered. It's kind of sobering, but it's the most real way of talking about where you get in deep heartbreak, in deep ground down to the sober reality of how experience is never dependable. Experience comes and goes. Like, everything out here is just changing, not according to what I want. It's not in my control. And so at whatever point, for me, it was after many years of deep work, and then that darkness just came right at the exact right moment, like right at rock bottom. It just showed up and said, and now you can let go. And I think the part of me that moved in response and said, yes, I want to let go, was honestly a place that was just exhausted of resisting, exhausted of fighting. And I hear this from a lot of people who've had awakenings and walked through this journey, is that the real point of transformation is when you admit, I can't do this. I can't force the world into the the shape of my preference.
And there's that collapse.
There's a collapse.
And that's what I see is that moment in the dark when people collapse.
Yeah.
And I'd say it's more pronounced in the women who come, as they tend to have a greater ease or capacity to collapse, as men tend to hold themselves strong, and collapsing is not really culturally acceptable. And so I notice that the feminine in there can collapse, and there's not this posturing of not knowing and like, I can do it. But certainly men have that experience in there as well. It's not as prevalent, and it sometimes is a little bit more challenging, but it's that moment of collapse where we just fall into whatever's present.
Yeah. And what I discovered is what's present is actually so much love. So much intimacy and so much willingness, and all of what I was wanting to have and connect to, and the like longing for intimacy out there in my life, out there, everything around me was actually fulfilled. The feeling of true intimacy that my being was longing for was so deeply fulfilled as soon as I collapsed. And it was all recognized as, actually, it's here. It's already here. The intimacy, the belonging, at the bottom of that collapse is the greatest precious love and holding. Like you fall off the cliff and the darkness catches you. And there's this love that's there when we give up the resisting. And that's the best news, and maybe the only encouraging news when you're in that moment of like, God, this is hard. And we're struggling with the heartbreak and the feelings of, I don't want to collapse. And that's actually really why I offer the work that I do to other men, and in sort of the online masculine support work that I do with spiritual community for the masculine. I work with another facilitator, Tobin Zivin, and we co-facilitate this group called the Awakened Brotherhood. And I'm just about to offer, starting in January, a group called Being the Light in the Darkness. And it's really for men to do exactly what you just described, which is to go to that fertile void, that place that gives all our light and all our form being, to like go to that source point in themselves, to collapse with sincerity into the void of their own being, which really in a lot of ways is actually to contact and fully develop direct intimacy with the feminine source of our masculine lives. So there's this fertile womb-like void in the darkness, which we all carry. And it's been something that men have unfortunately been kind of culturally pushed away from, but it's definitely time for us to reacquaint ourselves. So that work is really exciting to me.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that moment of collapse also dissolves the grasping for experience, like where you said you're more interested in being with what's appearing as opposed to preferring something over what's appearing. And I think that's one of the biggest gifts that the darkness has given me, is it's taken my seeking from like a 10, where I spent years and years in solitude, grasping after, even when I had it, but continuing, like holding on to just the ecstatic experience that I wanted and longed for. The darkness brought that from a 10 to like a 2. Now my seeking's more subtle and elusive and harder for me to see. But I know it's there. But it's taken a different form as I'm really clear that what I want is in the spaciousness of being with whatever is appearing. And we've all heard things like that over and over again, but it takes on a different meaning when you enter into the darkness and you see how much what we do in our lives is by the majority driven by covering up the discomfort that we don't want to feel. But I think a lot of times it's tricky and we don't see that. The moment we feel discomfort, we're reaching for our phone, we're going for a walk, or we're meditating or chanting or pray, or going a cold plunge or a run, things that are so wholesome that we don't even notice that subtly the reason that we're doing that is to really get intimate with what's appearing.
Yeah. I have you to thank actually for some sage wisdom you dropped in my lap the day I went into darkness, exactly about that. There's a lot of things you could have said to me that introductory conversation before I went in, but you made a point of saying, my strongest recommendation for you is to rest and to explore kind of a legendary level of rest, which is funny because it makes it sound like, oh, I'm going to rest. Like I'm going to do a legendary level of resting. Like, oh, there's this beautiful collapse in the word rest. Like rest actually is the invitation. Rest from your posturing, rest from your pursuits, rest from your seeking, your burning, your inquiry, your all the pushing. What happens when you rest from every sort of shape that you try to bring to the unknown of each moment? What happens when you rest? What's actually there when you rest from all that efforting? Mm-hmm. And that is this beautiful alchemical ingredient that allows the true devotional collapse to begin to move and proceed. Mm-hmm. And I just really appreciate your offer, because it actually had a big impact. And, you know, it's one of the things that as a fellow seeker, I really deeply understand. There's a great little trap built right into our deep seeking. Actually, it kind of comes down to this tattoo that I have on my forearm, which is a Rumi quote. And it says, whatever you seek is seeking you. Which is key, because seeking the way we feel it most of the time is such a unidirectional force, right? I am seeking something. Mm-hmm. And the darkness did this beautiful thing for me that feels very much like this tattoo wisdom, is I could feel the darkness seeking me. And all of a sudden, the sort of inside out thing just started to break down, because there was such an intimacy wanting my attention, and yet it was nothing that my conscious mind could see or identify or define. There was just a pure presence, a pure intimacy, a nameless presence in that darkness that wanted my full attention. In full rest, which was a different combination. Mm-hmm. How to actually give my entire being without actually trying to do anything. Mm-hmm. It was very much a giving over.
It can kind of be counterintuitive. It's this, when people come into the dark. Well, to backtrack, like, a lot of people, myself included, when I first went in, feel like they're very well prepared for the dark. Like people are like, oh, I've done meditation retreats, or I've done a lot of plant medicine, or I've done this, and this. And like, I'm like, well, yeah, but like, are you ready to die? Like, are you really willing to be done with experience? And are you willing to just rest in the simplicity of nothing? From that, there's a lot there. It's everything, but that door in is into the simplicity of nothing, being nothing special, not having a grand experience, not having any kind of revelation, not having anything intelligent or wise to share. Like, just, can you step into the fear of being really small and being nothing and no one? And it's also that collapse feels a little counterintuitive in how it happens in the dark. Like you shared, there was a woman who came some months ago, and she had had chronic depression for years, and she was struggling in the dark. She wanted to have a mind-blowing experience, and she was becoming really intimate to start with. She was becoming intimate with her worldly desires, which is where a lot of people aren't even that clear on what they want, because we just follow the cultural flow of like what we feel is important. And she was like, well, I want this, 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 and this. I want to be popular. I want people to notice me, and like all these superficial things that, like, if we all look at, we have on some level. And went through just asking her different questions, she arrived at that, like, actually what she really wants is acceptance, to be accepted by others. And then as she went deeper, it was to accept herself. And when I went back up the next night and asked her how her exploration into acceptance was going, she said she was afraid that if she accepted how she felt, which was depressed and horrible and worthless, that if she accepted that it would never go away. And I asked her, what happens if it never goes away? What if that feeling never goes away? Do you want to be forever at odds with it for the rest of your life? Or would you rather just accept it and allow it to be there? And when I went up the next night, she was so ecstatic. She was like crying in gratitude. She's like, I've been part of gratitude circles before, but I've never actually been grateful. And she said it went away. Like, I accepted it and I was with it for a while. And then like I opened to a space where like there's this depression and also, and like it's not the center. There's more. And when I was some months later, I was reflecting on her experience, and I was feeling like shit that day. And I had it like, oh, I want to go for a run. I know if I go for a run, I'll feel a lot better. I know how to get myself out of this shitty feeling. But I thought of her, she popped into my mind, and I was like, actually, I'm going to explore just resting into this feeling. Which maybe in the dark, you don't have a choice. You can do a few things and you can try, but ultimately at the end of the day, you don't have a choice. And, but in my day to day, I have lots of choices to avoid and come out of discomfort. But I laid down, and in that moment, I really felt her, where I was like, well, I don't like this feeling. And if I just rest into it, I want it to go away, but resting into it doesn't feel like it's actually going to help this go away. It feels like and so I really connected with that thread of like, if I accept this part of myself that I don't want, how's it going to change? But of course there's the inquiry of like, who wants it to change? Why do you want it to change? But in resting into it, for me in that moment, there was an opening to it, and then really connecting with the space that holds it and allows it. And then going deeper into that is the truth of what I am, which far extends beyond my really small experience of what's appearing.
Her story is really touching to hear, actually, because it probably in some ways, because it reminds me of things I've lived and been through, but also that I've seen and served and worked with a lot of people who are struggling with deep chronic depression or real deep inner agony. And there's it does feel like we're hitting a little bit of a crux move collectively in this consciousness journey and in the struggle, in the levels of depression, the levels of suicide. Like you look at youth, you look at disadvantaged youth, and we are seeing suicide levels that are historically really unprecedented. And I get the sense that we are collectively really kind of in a very poignant bargaining place with our own self-consciousness. And of course that shows up in society and in the way we relate as human beings to each other, but its origin point is within each of us, the way we relate to our own inner resistance, the things that are painful. And I guess the thing that's obvious to say is I just wish this medicine of this darkness for everyone. I wish that everyone who needs it could have access to it, because it really does get to the heart of the matter in a way that very, very few things in the world today do, in terms of true source, returning to the source of where all our struggle arises from, and also returning to the source of where our peace, where our release, and where our self-love and self-acceptance arise from. Like when we remove all the distractions and all the teachings, and this is, I say that with full love and respect for all the lineages and awakened masters and teachings throughout time that have been truly instrumental to my journey and so many people. Like it's all essential and necessary. And there's a time where putting something more on your plate is not actually helping, where we actually have to like clear down to the root of what am I really unwilling to feel. And it's something I just keep coming back to. A dear friend summarized the path of medicine that way to me beautifully once. He said, the fundamental question here is, what are you unwilling to feel? And I think the darkness is the highest level teacher in that regard. It's an absolute awakened master of what are you unwilling to feel. And as much as we try to fix, that fundamental question is going to remain until we find the place like the story you shared, where this woman is negotiating, what if this just worst case scenario? How am I with worst case scenario? There's a level of intimacy in that's really kind of the breaking point, the collapse point, the surrender point, which is a tricky place because, you know, when you're depressed, that's literally the worst thing you can imagine. So that I don't say that lightly. Like that's a tall ask. That's a tall order. And yet ultimately it's the place where breakthrough always happens. Is where there's no exit strategy from being with what's here. And I feel like we need a very special level of support from each other. You know, there's a reason it was Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. Like, there's the fact that we have a path, it's walkable. Yes, those first two things are very important. But that we don't walk it alone, that there's support. And that's a very unique part of this whole darkness thing, because in some ways it feels like you're really stepping away from Sangha. You're going solo in just you. A lot of people say, like, why would you go do solitary confinement, like voluntarily? And what I discovered when I first sat down, the first hour in the darkness, all my guides, allies, my family, my friends, my loved ones, you know, everybody showed up and formed a circle in the darkness with me and sat down and said, we are here with you. We are here with you and we're not leaving. So it was surprising to me the level of intimacy I felt with others in that space. And I've heard that from a lot of people, that who you love and your connection to them becomes of the utmost importance in there. You can actually feel like the vibrant, true umbilicus of Sangha, like holding you in your life. The love that you share with other human beings literally is your umbilicus to your life in a lot of ways. Like, we need each other. And so there's something, I love this sort of interest that we're developing. You and I talked about it this morning, about developing Sangha around darkness. And I think this podcast and the work that we're doing here just to share this is part of that Sangha. And there's a way in which we can actually give each other and hold each other in the greatest gift of, you can go and be with the true source point of you and know that we're here supporting you. So I love this feeling of like, don't be afraid that you're alone, even though that's really important, that you need to feel truly alone, because there's also this Sangha. And so I bless and welcome the energy of like a Sangha of darkness, that we hold each other in these pursuits and recognize the true value, and that we can actually anchor in to that community, to that, because this relational field of this community of consciousness awakening and facing and collapsing to truth in this way is a really important part of the journey.
Yes. Awesome. How would you say it's, to circle back to that first question of like, how has the darkness transformed your life in form? Like, transformed your life in the formless, and then how did it spill over?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the ways would be that I just have had so much more energy. Like, my form, my body, my living day-to-day life is just infused with all this extra energy. I don't really know how to put it more simply or directly, but there's just more of me available. And the me is the we. Like, the me is actually not the personality and not Eli. It's this intimacy. And that's allowing me to really show up in service and really show up and be a loving pillar and support for others much more. So I'm seeing this kind of beautiful domino effect of how my greater energy is catalyzing others to be more available and to pursue this work more deeply themselves. And I also feel like here we are. Like, it's changing the way I'm woven into community. I just recently moved to this community, and this experience and the responses I've felt from this community through connecting with you, connecting with the dark, devoting myself in this way, it's opened up so much connection, which is precious, invaluable. Somehow, through taking this step backwards out of the world, going into solitary confinement, it delivered me to unbelievable new levels of connection. That there was something by taking the backward step and connecting to that deep inner intimacy that, in this serendipitous, magical way, then led to more and more of the outer connection in the world that I was looking for. And there's something, being someone who's kind of worked with plant medicine and been on that path for a while, you just get the signature of magic, of medicine, of life working in its beautiful, rascally, coyote, magical way behind the scenes when stuff like that happens, when you do something that's the opposite of what you think you should do and it leads you to what you want. There's something about that. There's something about the contrarian magic of stepping away from everything that brings you closer to everything. And that's one of the things that I just am continually in awe of with the darkness and the way it's brought me closer to everything. Especially, when you're in there, at times you feel so wishing you could, like, you just long for these experiences, these people, it brings you to the place in yourself where your true love for connection lives. And there's some beautiful shriving, some like refining back to what you truly love. That is really magical. It's There's nothing else like that.
I love that. We touched on that. It brings you back to what you truly love. That in our day-to-day, I think we had touched on it, like a lot of the things that we love are because of the cultural lens that we exist in, and the things that are in front of us that we can do. Like in terms of what we engage in the world, we're going to love what we can engage in what's provided for us to engage in. Like we haven't really had the opportunity to engage in solitude, so we don't really have a love for solitude. Some people might have like a natural kind of movement towards it, but when you drop into the darkness and you really finally touch that you want to be happy and that you love connection, and here are your options. You're in the dark. You don't get to connect to external form, and you don't have many things that you can do to be happy. The exploration begins of what can I do? How can I be to be happy? How can I be to connect deeply to something meaningful? And there's no fooling yourself in the dark. Like in life, I can feel a strong sense of self and feel meaningful when the world is telling me I'm doing good work. And it feels really true. Like I feel meaningful when like the world's telling me I'm doing good work, or my kids are like, I love you, or like someone looks at me lovingly and like is like, that's good work. I'm like, yeah, that's good work. I feel good. I'm meaningful. I feel connected and whole. And then you're in the dark and there's not that. And so when you feel connected and whole and meaningful in the dark, you've sourced that from somewhere so deep down, because you are not getting that from anything external. And it's and when we really awaken to our true own desires and movements outside of culture, which happens when you're in the dark, it moves us into connecting into that space, and it can't be taken away. And that's one thing for me that's carried on, is there's such a deep familiarity with completeness and wholeness and the great perfection, as in Dzogchen. Like that's like, it's just the space that holds it all. And then, of course, there's the insanity and the chaos and like everything that fills that space, along with the beauty and the love and all of it. But like, it's that wholeness that holds it. And that's really touched me in the dark and has moved into my movement in form, where there's that Andrew Holset quote, who wrote Dream Yoga, where it's like awareness comes to prefer itself over external form. And I think in the darkness, you really there are no external forms to prefer. And positive thinking doesn't get you through. And so your path to salvation is the space that holds it all. And not, like you initially said in the beginning, is not preferring one appearance over another, because it just doesn't deliver you to freedom, which is clear in the dark. And then when we really rest into that in the dark, it spills over. Of course, I get caught all the time. Things aren't going my way all the time in my day-to-day, and there's certainly plenty of times that I get caught in that. But then I awaken back to that remembrance of like what I am, and that like I don't really care what's appearing when I'm really honest with who I am and what I want, because those things will come and go. And one thing I ask some people in the dark, when it feels like it's an appropriate, supportive exploration, is like, what if this was your last day to live? And people think about that, and it's been talked about, but it's very different in the dark, where you're It's like, well, yeah, this is a great day. The sun's shining and everything's going my way. It's like, well, yeah, well, how about when you're completely miserable and you've been robbed of all your support? And it's like, what if this is your last day to live? How strong is our desire, and or are we able to connect with our desire to just simply want to live if this was our last day? And sometimes that's the thing that brings people through in there, and sometimes it's just not. But yeah,
that present moment dilation that occurs in darkness is pretty special. The way it makes me think of our sort of perception and the way we've become kind of addicted to time. And, that question of what if this were your last day? There's such a strong, kind of compulsory relationship that we have with time in our normal lives, in this culture in particular. Arguably the second most workaholic culture on planet Earth. And, there really is something here about coming out of addiction. I feel this, that there's coming out of the addiction of structuring and following schedules and itineraries and a whole linear orientation to life based on a clock, based on what must be done. I feel that this work and this space of the darkness is actually giving our culture a great gift. And I know it's given individuals and subcultures throughout human history a great gift. The lineages, Dzogchen you mentioned, and many others that have used the true medicine of the darkness to help reorient to truth in the way that culture gets fixated on linearity and externalities, is very helpful. It's very, very helpful at this time. And, you see retreat centers around the country. Esalen is a great example. Like they've, new ownership, and they've reworked their offerings to be much more clearly directed towards technology, addiction, nervous system issues in our culture. Like the offerings of retreat and holistic therapeutic centers of learning throughout our culture are starting to shift because they're recognizing the intrinsic, addictive, destructive qualities of what even just the world of screens has done to us, has done to our attention and our ability to feel the root of like what's real, what we love, why living actually matters, like why the hell we're here. It's not to just, get the cool next like or reel. It's this intimacy, this true feeling of, having the love that makes life real. And I sense that we're at this beautiful tipping point where we're starting to reevaluate the addictions that we've gone along with, maybe unknowingly. It just happens. It's just this weird kind of thing that culture and society it happens by sort of slow incremental flow. And then all of a sudden you wake up one day and you look at your phone and you spend a certain amount on screen time. And you're like, wait a minute, when I was a kid, I didn't even have a phone. And now I spend 7 hours on my phone? Like, what happened to my life? What happened to my connections? What happened to my relationships? What happened to my intimacy and belonging to myself? What happened to my connection to nature, to community, to watersheds, to the world that I'm a participant and steward of as a human being? So there's this call that the darkness really is beautifully asking me, and I think a lot of us, to reevaluate what we're addicted to and why, and how we really belong here.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I think about in the arc of like transformation, there's, in the early years, teenage years, early 20s, there's a lot of transformation that happens as people come into exploring themselves, just spirituality aside, just as we grow. And then there's this kind of stagnation we get kind of settled in who and what we are. And it's really hard. Plant medicine can help open something, but it doesn't really land you in there grounded, integrated in the awakening that plant medicine maybe opens you to. And then in our later life, when people start to embrace the fact that they might actually die, which we tend to just fear and not really be ready for. And then like the chronic illnesses that, maybe come, that really force us to be intimate, like pain forces us to be intimate with what's happening. And in the dark, not that it's an overwhelmingly painful experience, there's discomfort that certainly arises from the things that we don't want to experience, but that it's like you almost get to fast forward to the end when you get into the dark. And there's like if one were lying on their deathbed and had the grace of actually knowing that like this was close to the end, there's a real connection with like what really matters. And like when you have a chronic illness, it's like in that moment you connect with what really matters. And I feel like the darkness is similar to those experiences where you get to fast forward to the end, to fast forward like what would it be if I had, and no one ever wants to imagine that, and most people don't, and if they do, it's like it might be for a moment, but like in the darkness, it's like that you step into a mindset like that, where if you had a chronic illness or you were on your deathbed, there is this sense of like what really matters, and a reorganizing and a rewiring of like really meeting what's present. If you have a chronic illness, you have no choice at that point. And that's a lot of people have awakenings through that. And in their older age, older people are a lot wiser. And then to look at like why, typically, maybe like why does that wisdom come, with age and being with somebody who's about to cross over, like what's happened. And then looking at the darkness and seeing similar threads that weave in because we arrive, because we're in a world where like what's happening we can't actually change. There's the awareness that we have no control to change what's occurring, and there is that true movement to be intimate with what's appearing.
Yeah, because that's interestingly really the true teaching of death is appreciate this moment. Because that's all we ever have. Mm-hmm. And death really reminds us of that very poignantly. So and I think it's that's a big part of why darkness is such profound medicine. Mm-hmm. Is it delivers us back to the present in a way that is very deeply honest. There's an honesty. And I love that piece of this, like this central practice of honesty. And darkness is a master of honesty.
Mm-hmm. And there was this, to start to wrap it up, but when you and I were talking, when you came out of the dark, yeah. There's that moment of really landing in how, like, on the topic of death, that like when there is that full intimacy and surrender, that like life is that death, it was that life is just as mysterious as death.
Nice. Yeah.
And that exploration of how much we posture and how much we control and how much we know that just shrouds the mystery of life.
Right.
And when we're just totally intimate with what's appearing, we don't know, nor do we even care what's next.
Right.
And there ultimately becomes a comfort that arises in that, because we're no longer trying to control what's next.
That's right. Yeah. And for me, that's where that intimacy really became so evident, that there only through being willing to die before we die do we really get contact with this intimacy that's so full of love and willingness and honesty. Like that we truly get to experience everything that we most essentially need when we're willing to die before we die, to really enter this unnameable place of, as we spoke about, that collapse into truly intimately meeting what's arising rather than structuring it according to our preferences. So I think that's, maybe in closing, that's just a prayer of gratitude to the benefit of darkness, and to just really anyone who's considering this to really know that there is a practice here and there is a medicine here in this work that will lead you to your greatest nightmare and right through it to your greatest dream. And that there's something about that sequence that's very important for us to be honest about. That we actually need to die through that which we are most afraid of to receive what we most deeply want. And it's the collapsation of that polarity of trying to think that we can separate what we're most afraid of from what we most love. That darkness is such a gift around.
Yes, beautiful. And so before we close, where can people find you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So you can find me at theawakenedbrotherhood.com, and you can also find me through my website, which is Inner Guidance, which is inguidance.com. And I'm here in Ashland, Oregon, and I'd also just would love to have people find me more and more here through Sky Caves, and actually really wanting to support and encourage the work and development of this place and Sky Caves as an offering, which feels truly unique in not just the Western U.S., but really the Northern Hemisphere. I think there's something happening here that's truly remarkable. So it's a joy to be able to sit down with you in person and be able to receive people here in this place also.
Beautiful. Oh, it's been lovely being here with you, Eli.
Yeah, thanks, brother.
Yeah, awesome.